Hello, this is Dr. Eric Wiseman, Associate Professor of Urban Forestry in the Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation at Virginia Tech. Today I'm here to talk to you about landscape tree pruning. Some of the things that we will cover today are the tools that are used for pruning, pruning needs, pruning objectives, guiding principles of pruning, and pruning practices. What I have gathered here is an assortment of tools that are used for pruning landscape trees, as well as some of the equipment that we have to use for safe work practices in pruning. My goal here is to share with you each of the various types of tools that we commonly use for pruning landscape trees and tell you a little bit about their uses and safety precautions. The most important consideration when pruning landscape trees is the safety of us as the worker, as well as people who might be around us and the property that we are working on. So the first step in performing landscape tree pruning is to delineate and exclude our work zone. The way that we would typically do that would be to use traffic cones, signs, or caution ribbon, something that will identify the area that we are working in and put other people on notice that this is a work area and that they should avoid the area. Here I have some traffic cones that we might minimally use for setting up a work zone area. Of course, whether or not we use signage will depend on how intensively the site is being used. If we're working in a relatively rural area or working on a parcel of land where we have strict control on who can come in and out of that area, we might not necessarily need cones or signs. But if we're working in areas that are open to the public or that are very busy, we do need to give consideration to people's safety and set up the work zone accordingly. We also have to be mindful about protecting features on the landscape that we might possibly damage during the pruning activities. This could be other plant material, it could be buildings, it could be statues, it could be other features in the landscape or garden that people consider to be particularly valuable and that could easily be damaged during the process of pruning. The first safety precaution when pruning trees is to be sure that you're wearing appropriate clothing. Generally, this would be long sleeve shirts and long pants and sturdy boots in order to prevent you from being scratched by the branches that you're handling, as well as potentially being cut by the hand tools that you're handling. Long pants and sleeves will not prevent severe cuts with hand saws and certainly will not prevent cuts with chainsaws, but it can be your first line of protection. And certainly you have to be thoughtful about the weather conditions that you're working in. Wearing long pants, long shirts, or other heavy clothing might not be appropriate when the temperatures are very high, because then you expose yourself to another safety hazard, and that is heat exhaustion. Along with clothing, you may also choose to wear some type of glove. You can get relatively light duty gloves for warmer occasions or insulated gloves for colder occasions. Make sure that you use a glove that has a strong grip surface on it. That'll be very important for safely handling your tools as well as handling the branches that you will be pruning. If you will be working with a wood chipper in the process of pruning trees, it is also important to make sure that you wear a tight-fitting glove that might not potentially snag on brush as it's being inserted into the wood chipper. Another very important piece of personal protective equipment are safety glasses. Safety glasses will help prevent getting eye pokes from branches as well as dust from the saw getting over into your eyes and causing abrasions or irritation of your eyes. There are very specific requirements for appropriate safety glasses. First of all, they have to have a shatter-resistant lens, and secondly, the frame must have the lens wrapped completely around your eye to minimize dust and branches getting in from the side of the lenses. Another important part of the personal protective equipment during pruning is a hard hat or industrial helmet. Like the safety glasses, there are very specific requirements for the construction and certification of hard hats and industrial helmets. These can be found in the ANSI Z133 standards as well as various state and federal regulations. This particular hard hat here is a tree climber's arborist helmet that is intended for use while climbing in trees, but it also works really well for ground operations with the chin strap, because you often find yourself looking up into the tree, and having the chin strap will ensure that the helmet stays properly situated on your head for appropriate protection. The other feature on this particular hard hat is that it has integrated into it ear muffs. Ear muffs are intended to protect your ears and your hearing from high decibel sounds that might cause hearing loss when you're running mechanized machinery such as chainsaws, shears, or wood chippers. The final component of personal protective equipment for use during pruning that I will describe here today are chainsaw chaps. These chainsaw chaps are intended to reduce the severity of an injury that might occur if a chainsaw makes contact with your lower extremities. General best practice is that you should always have on chainsaw chaps when operating a chainsaw on the ground. Chainsaw chaps are not necessarily required for arborists who are climbing trees, but it's always a good idea to have some type of chainsaw resistant clothing when you're working as an arborist in a tree using a chainsaw, because there's still a risk of injury from chainsaws while aloft. A final consideration for pruning safely is to be prepared for an accident. Two different ways you can prepare for that is to, first of all, make sure that you have a first aid kit on hand. A first aid kit will allow you to immediately treat various types of injuries that might occur during pruning operations, and have an emergency response plan. That emergency response plan will include, first of all, administering first aid, and then secondly, making appropriate contact with emergency personnel if additional medical treatment is required. Now that we've covered some of the basics of pruning safely, we'll now discuss some of the tools that are commonly used for landscape tree pruning. The pruning tools that I'm showing today are the most basic types of landscape tree pruning tools. Understand that sometimes specialized pruning tools are necessary for certain trees, certain pruning objectives, or in certain landscape situations. The first pruning tool that I am describing today is the chainsaw. It is the only mechanized pruning tool that I'll be describing, but understand that sometimes other types of specialized tools such as shears might be appropriate for shrubs or small trees or specialty pruning operations. This particular model is a small displacement, short-barred, top-handled saw that is designed specifically for arborists working at heights on rope and harness or in an aerial lift. But you could also use it at ground level as well. Chainsaws are most appropriate when you are pruning large diameter branches where it would be unsafe or inefficient to try to use a manual tool. However, understand that pruning with a chainsaw is very dangerous and should only be undertaken by qualified, trained individuals. There are many resources out on the internet, and there's also descriptions in the ANSI Z133 about the safety precautions necessary for pruning trees with a chainsaw. The rest of the pruning tools I'll be describing here are all manual, meaning they are not powered by a motor or an external power source. Manual pruning tools come in various size, shapes, configurations, and cutting surfaces. Understand that the choice of a pruning tool should be dictated by your pruning objective and your safety precautions and your need for efficient work practices. Manual pruning tools can be classified in two different ways. First would be the type of cutting implement they have, and there's two major groups there. One would be the sawing tools and the other would be the clipping tools. The other way that we might categorize manual pruning tools is by their reach. One group is intended to work in close proximity at hands or arm's reach, and the other major group are pole tools that are intended to prune branches at heights above the ground. The first group of manual pruning tools are the clipping type pruning tools. Here I have two types of manual clipping pruning tools. The first is the hand shear, which comprises a pair of handles, a spring, a blade, and an anvil. And this particular type here is what is called a bypass pruner, meaning that the blade, when it contracts and begins to approach the anvil, in completing the cut, the blade bypasses the anvil. And this is important because this ensures a cleaner cut and better wound closure for the portion of the branch that remains after executing the pruning cut. The size branch that can be cut with hand shears depends on a lot of different factors. The two primary factors would be the species that you're pruning, and thereby the density of the wood that makes it relatively easy or difficult to prune the branch. And then the second would be your personal hand strength. Generally speaking, hand shears would be appropriate for branches that range in diameter from 1/4 of an inch up to 1 inch in diameter, but that will vary on the individual as well as the species being pruned. The other manual pruning tool with a clip-type cutting mechanism is the lopper. Its cutting mechanism is very similar to the hand shear in that it consists of a blade and an anvil, and when the two are situated around the branch and the handles are closed, the blade cuts across the branch and then severs it cleanly as it bypasses the anvil. Loppers are good for pruning larger branches in diameter than the hand shears because the elongated handles act as a lever, and plus you can use both hands in executing the cut. So typically you can prune branches from 1 up to 2 inches in diameter with a pair of loppers. The elongated handles also make it easier to cut branches at heights as well as reach further into the crown of a tree to make a pruning cut. It is important to not try to cut too large of a branch with loppers because it will result in an improper cut, damaging the branch, as well as puts a lot of stress and strain on your muscles and your joints. The other group of manual pruning tools that are used when pruning branches at arm's reach are the hand saws. Hand saws come in various lengths as well as tooth configurations that enable you to cut relatively small or relatively large branches and relatively smooth versus relatively coarse cuts. When choosing a hand saw, it's important to think about the type of pruning that you will be doing, the species you'll be working with, and the size branches that you'll be cutting, and then choose your hand saw appropriately. This is an example of a pruning hand saw with a fixed blade design, meaning that the handle does not articulate or fold relative to the blade. Features of this particular hand saw are the coarse tooth configuration and the curvature of the blade. Those two features make it easier to cut large diameter branches with this saw. It depends on the species of tree being cut and the physical dexterity of the individual using the saw, but it might be possible to cut a branch up to 4 or 5 inches in diameter with this hand saw. A pruning hand saw of this size typically has a coarse tooth pattern, meaning that it makes a very aggressive cut through the wood. This is helpful for efficiently and quickly cutting through large diameter branches, but understand that it does result in a relatively ragged cut, and this can cause problems with wound closure on thin barked or small diameter branches. In those cases, you want to opt for a hand saw that has a smaller blade or has a finer tooth configuration. A pruning hand saw with a folding blade. The intention of this is to safely tuck the blade into the handle, making the hand saw smaller for storage and making it more portable. On this smaller style hand saw, there's a couple different differences in the blade design. First is that it has a straight blade design. There's no curvature, which makes it easier to get the blade into smaller spaces on smaller trees. And it also has a slightly less aggressive or coarse tooth configuration, which means it will make a relatively cleaner cut, which might be appropriate on smaller trees that have thin bark. This is another example of a folding hand saw, and it's very similar in design and style and size to this one that I showed you earlier. The biggest difference is that this saw has a finer tooth configuration than this saw. What that means is that when this particular handsaw is used to make a pruning cut, it will be a much smoother cut. This might be more suitable for small diameter branches with thin bark, where there might be risk of tearing when using a more aggressive saw. With their shorter blade design, these two saws would be appropriate for smaller diameter branch cutting. This would be intermediate to what you might be able to cut with a pair of hand shears or loppers and the larger fixed blade design pruning handsaw. You might find yourself using these hand saws for cutting branches in the range of 1 to 3 inches in diameter. The final group of manual pruning tools are the pole tools. These are intended to allow you to extend your reach to prune branches that are high above the ground. Pruning poles are crafted from various materials. Traditionally, they were crafted from solid wood, but in more recent years, fiberglass and other types of composites have been used. The reason for the move to fiberglass is twofold. One is that it is lighter, stiffer, and importantly, it does not conduct electricity. And electrocution shock is a safety consideration when working in urban areas and pruning high above your head, where a pruning tool might come in contact with an overhead electrical conductor. This particular design is articulating, meaning that multiple poles can be assembled together to extend the reach. This particular model comes in 6-foot sections, and so typically you would work with 1 or 2, maybe sometimes 3 sections, in theory extending your reach above ground in the range of 18 to 24 feet. Understanding when you work with multiple sections of an articulating pole, it can be much more difficult to handle the tool as well as to make proper pruning cuts, and it also increases your exposure to certain types of hazards and injuries. Pole pruning tools can be affixed with both of the major cutting mechanisms, the clip type and the saw type. The pole pruner head has a similar cutting mechanism to the hand shears and the loppers. It comprises a blade and an anvil, in this case configured as a hook, a lever that's attached to a pulley, and passing through the pulley is a rope that is secured at the base of the pruner. It uses the same bypass cutting mechanism as the hand shear and the lopper, ensuring that you get a clean, smooth surface cut. As you can see by the opening of the pulley of the hook here, the size branch that it will typically accommodate ranges in size from about 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inch in diameter. The other cutting mechanism with pole pruning tools is the pole saw. It consists of a head that fits into the end of the pole and then has a blade that is very similar to the standard handsaw that we saw earlier. It has a curved blade with relatively coarse teeth, which allows you to cut branches, large branches, very efficiently. You might find yourself using this particular saw design for cutting branches that are 4, 5, maybe even 6 inches in diameter, depending on the species and depending on your physical abilities and your ability to work safely in making that large cut. Pole pruning tools can make your work much more efficient for working with medium and large size trees. However, pole pruning tools may expose you to additional hazards and risks, and you must take appropriate safety precautions. The advantage of pole pruning tools is they allow you to work more efficiently. In contrast to working off of a ladder and using near reach hand tools, a pole saw or pole pruner will allow you to work around the perimeter of the crown and reach high into the tree without having to move around a ladder, which takes more time and also can possibly pose some additional safety hazards. Dr. Alex Shigo famously stated that pruning is one of the best things we could do for a tree, but one of the worst things we can do to a tree. The reason he said this is because when we prune a tree of live branches, we are removing leaf area that is necessary to feed the tree, and we're creating wounds that open the tree to the possibility of pest infestation and require energy for wound closure. Because of this, we have to be very thoughtful about our pruning practices and our pruning objective. Having a good objective for pruning means that we have thought about the type of tree, the health and vitality of the tree, the age of the tree, and how the tree functions in the landscape. Examples of pruning objectives include eliminating risks, hazards, or conflicts in the tree, improving the health, vitality, or structural stability of the tree, improving the appearance of the tree, or improving the tree's functionality in the landscape. When preparing a pruning prescription, we need to give careful thought to the dose, timing, and limits of the tree system. The dose means how much of the live branch and leaf surface area that we are going to remove from the tree. We do not want to remove any more branches than are absolutely necessary to achieve our objective because of the stress associated with that removal for the tree. The timing refers to either the life stage of the tree or the time of the year. Generally speaking, young trees have greater vitality and are more tolerant of pruning. Therefore, we might prescribe a heavier dose in order to achieve the pruning objective. In contrast, mature and veteran trees typically have lower vitality and can tolerate relatively less pruning. The ANSI A300 standards, Part 1 for pruning, describe what should be the appropriate guidelines for how many branches and how much leaf area to remove from a tree in any given pruning interval. A good rule of thumb is not to exceed more than 25%, understanding that sometimes the species vitality and objective may require more or likewise may require less. Related to this is understanding the limits of the tree system. What that means is understanding how frequently that we can prune trees without causing adverse effects on them. Sometimes our pruning objective requires us to prune the trees annually, particularly if we are trying to achieve some particular size or growth habit for the tree. In other instances, we may not prune trees, but perhaps once every few years, or maybe even once every few decades. The key is to understand the age, vitality, and life stage of the tree, and prescribe an appropriate dose of pruning accordingly to meet our pruning objective. Generally speaking, there are two types of landscape tree pruning. There is maintenance pruning, which is intended to address some type of existing conflict or issue in the tree's architecture. And then there is structural pruning. Structural pruning is primarily intended for immature and juvenile trees, where we're trying to attempt to establish a strong structural form to the branch attachments and crown architecture of the tree. Some examples of the pruning methods that are used in maintenance pruning include crown cleaning, crown thinning, crown raising, and crown reduction. Crown cleaning entails the selective removal of dead, diseased, dying, or defective branches. Crown thinning entails the selective removal of branches towards the interior of the crown in order to improve air and light penetration or to increase visibility through the crown or light penetration through the crown to the ground below. Crown raising entails selective removal of lower branches on the crown of the tree in order to provide vertical clearance for visibility or for passage or to reduce conflicts with vehicles or pedestrians. Crown reduction is the selective removal of branches around the periphery of the crown in order to reduce crown spread or crown height such that the tree no longer conflicts with surrounding areas, or in an effort to reduce the wind sail and weight and load on the crown of the tree when we are trying to reduce failure risks. Understand that crown reduction must be carefully prescribed for mature trees. The amount of removal of leaf area and branches to attain an appreciable reduction in crown size can be significant and may exceed the tolerances of the tree. What should not be done to reduce tree size is what is known as topping. Topping is the indiscriminate reduction of tree size using inappropriate pruning cuts that stress the tree due to the entire removal of the canopy of foliage and leaving very large diameter pruning wounds that the tree has a difficult time responding to and make it structurally unstable thereafter. In cases where the objective for reducing the size of the tree cannot be achieved using crown reduction within the limits and standards of ANSI A300, then instead consideration should be given to either removing and replacing the tree or moving the tree to another location where it will not conflict with its surroundings. As trees grow older and mature, their vitality tends to slow down and they tend to accumulate much more deadwood in them. This deadwood can be problematic for the health of the tree as it may harbor pests, and it can also create a safety hazard and a nuisance and cleanup problem for urban landscapes. For this reason, we will often prescribe for maintenance pruning crown cleaning. Crown cleaning is the selective removal of dead, dying, diseased, and defective branches from the crown of the tree. This mature white oak in the background here would be a good example of a tree that we might prescribe crown cleaning to achieve an objective such as sanitation, safety, or aesthetics. This semi-mature willow oak would be an example of a landscape tree that might need some crown raising to increase the distance between the ground and low-hanging branches. As you can see over my shoulder, some of the bottom scaffold branches on this tree have elongated out over the sidewalk and will soon be drooping down to a height where they might conflict with pedestrians or bicyclists. In this case, crown raising might be appropriate in order to provide the appropriate clearance. With this mature green ash behind me, it has several codominant leaders with bark inclusions. These would be at increased risk of failure in an extreme storm event. We might prescribe crown reduction pruning for this tree in order to reduce the risk of failure. By reducing the crown of the tree, we will lessen the weight that is in the crown from the branches that we remove. We will reduce the wind sail of the winds hitting the tree during a weather event, and we will decrease the loading or stress that is exerted upon the weak branch unions and included bark. Behind me is a Japanese maple that is growing in close proximity to a building. Although the tree is compatible in this space, as it has matured, its branches have encroached upon the side of the building. This will be an example where crown reduction pruning might be appropriate in order to provide appropriate clearance between the tree and the building. The white fir behind me is an example of a conifer that may be susceptible to fungal foliar disease. In managing that disease, we may prescribe crown thinning in order to improve light penetration and air circulation in the interior of the crown. In this way, the foliage would dry out more quickly during the day and lessen the conditions that are favorable to the fungal foliar disease. Tree species vary in their maximum mature size, their growth rate, and their growth habit. All of these are important considerations with pruning. In terms of growth habit, there are two basic forms: excurrent growth habit and decurrent growth habit. The excurrent growth habit is very common in conifers, such as this dawn redwood behind me. Excurrent growth habit is typified by a dominant central leader from the trunk base all the way to the peak of the crown of the tree. Below that, you have subordinate lateral scaffold branches that tend to stay small relative to the excurrent leader. This is favorable growth habit because these types of branches are not likely to develop into codominant leaders or to develop included bark. The other primary growth habit in landscape trees is decurrent. A good example of decurrent growth habit is the yellow wood behind me. In this case, there tends to not be a single dominant central leader in the crown of the tree. Instead, the crown tends to be comprised of multiple codominant leaders. Decurrent growth habit trees are predisposed to developing many more of the structural defects that we have mentioned, such as codominant leaders, weak branch attachments, and bark inclusion. As a result, we oftentimes find ourselves paying a lot of attention to decurrent growth habit trees for our maintenance pruning, and our best opportunity to prevent these problems is through structural pruning when the tree is young. Here we can see close-up examples of the codominant leaders and bark inclusion that are common in decurrent growth habit trees. The bark occlusion occurs because as these codominant leaders get larger in diameter relative to one another, they begin to converge and press upon one another. The portions of the two stems that are in contact with one another develop included or trapped bark. This included or trapped bark is vulnerable to decay and cracking later on in the tree's life. It can become a weak spot where branches fail. Some tree species are very sturdy, have strong wood, and hold up relatively well even when they have codominant leaders and included bark. Other species that are weak-wooded tend to have more structural failures associated with codominant leaders and included bark. A good example of this problem is with the Callery pears. The most well-known of them is the Bradford pear. These trees have such a fast growth rate that they develop weak wood that does not have the structural integrity to withstand the strain that will be encountered later on in its life, and can often lead to these failures of codominant leaders and included bark. And this has been a common problem with Bradford pears, and one of the big reasons why they are not viewed widely as being suitable for landscape trees. Codominant leaders are a common problem in open-grown landscape trees. The reason for this is because there's an abundance of light and there's not a lot of competition from neighboring trees for space in that light. Therefore, we should put young trees on a structural pruning regime earlier in their lives so that we can eliminate codominant leaders and eliminate the risk of future defects and failures in the tree. The cherry bark oak behind me is an example of a young tree that's been on a structural pruning program and has responded very well to it. As you can see in the structure, it has a dominant central leader and well-spaced scaffold branches. This has been achieved by periodically pruning to remove tightly spaced scaffold branches and to subordinate or slow the growth rate of competing codominant leaders to ensure that the central leader remains dominant in the crown. When we determine that a landscape tree requires pruning, we prepare a pruning specification. The specification is a description of the scope, objective, and methods of pruning that will be used on the tree. The scope is where we identify the tree that will be pruned and where we will be pruning in the tree. The objective describes what we are trying to accomplish by removing branches from the tree, and the method is the description of the pruning cut types that will be used, the size range of the parts that will be removed, and the percentage of the branches that will be removed. On this young sycamore, we will demonstrate a branch removal cut. This branch removal cut will be used as part of crown raising objective. The reason for this crown raising is to reduce conflicts between this low branch and mowing equipment that passes by, as well as to provide clearance from the nearby vegetation. In preparing to perform this branch removal, I have first made sure that the work site is secure. I put up appropriate signage and precautions to exclude others from the site, and I have put on appropriate personal protective equipment, including hard hat, safety glasses, appropriate clothing, and gloves. I also have with me my pruning tools. In this case, I'll be using two manual tools. I have a pole saw and I have a hand saw. I will perform this branch removal in a two-step process. I'm going to first use the pole saw to remove the outer portion of the branch because the pole saw will allow me to get myself in position to safely drop the branch to the ground. After doing that, I will then use the hand saw to make the branch collar cut closer to the base of the stub that's left behind. I'm now prepared to conclude the branch removal cut by moving into the base of the severed branch and executing what is known as a collar cut. This collar cut location will be dictated by the location of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar that's swelling at the base of the branch where it joins with the trunk. In this last step of the branch removal cut, I first of all made sure to get myself into a position where I would be safe in performing the cut, and then secondly, positioning my saw outside the branch bark ridge and the branch collar so that I could make a clean cut that will promote wound closure with callus and wound wood. When a pruning cut is made to remove a branch from the trunk or from its parent branch, a wound is left behind. This wounding initiates a wound response by the tree. In the portion of the trunk or parent branch behind the pruning wound, there will be chemical alterations of the wood that resist the spread of pathogens infecting the tree. At the same time, a wound closure process will occur that involves callus and wound wood tissue. Here you can see on this tree development of callus tissue around the perimeter of branch removal pruning wounds. This callus and wound wood will be laid down in annual growth increments, forming concentric circles that will slowly cover the surface of the pruning wound, resulting in a complete fusion of wood tissues and bark tissues sealing over the pruning wound. On this oak, 2 scaffold branches were removed from the trunk a few years ago. You can see the wound response here with the concentric circles of callus and wound wood tissue that are nearly sealed over. The wound on the right of the screen is nearly completely sealed over, and the one to the left shows still a small portion of the interior branch core visible to the exterior. Within a few years, this wound too will also completely seal over, having a continuous layer of wood and bark. When removing a branch from its point of attachment at the trunk or a parent branch, it is important that we make that pruning cut outside of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. This will ensure that wound closure is effective. On this beach, the branch removal cut was performed incorrectly and damaged the branch bark ridge at the top of the branch attachment. We know this by looking at the thickness of the callus and wound wood tissue around the perimeter of the wound. In this case, the thickness of the callus and wound wood is relatively thick around the sides and bottom of the wound, but is very thin or almost absent near the top of the wound. This tells us that the cut was too close to the branch bark ridge at the top of the wound. This asymmetry in the callus and wound wood development is oftentimes also observed in trees that are older, of low vitality, or when a branch that is large diameter compared to the trunk is being removed. Improper pruning cuts can also be made when the branch is severed too far away from its point of attachment to the trunk or the parent branch. In this case, we call this a stub cut. On this green ash, we see an example of a stub cut in which any large portion of the base of the branch was left behind when the pruning cut was made. We know that this was an improper pruning cut by looking at the development of the callus tissue and looking at the amount of branch stub that was left behind. In this particular case, the stub is going to slow down the wound closure process and may leave behind a stub of wood that would be attractive to wood-boring pests or pathogens. Another type of pruning cut we use to achieve a pruning objective is the reduction cut. The reduction cut is different than the removal cut. The reduction cut shortens the primary axis of a branch back to a lateral that is large enough to assume apical dominance. The common rule of thumb that we use for this is to make sure that the lateral branch is at least 1/3 of the diameter of the primary axis that we are shortening. In a reduction cut, we are not pruning back to a branch bark ridge or a branch collar. Instead, we are using the orientation of the lateral branch to guide the orientation of our pruning cut. When performing a reduction cut, We want to make sure that we not only cut back to a lateral that is large enough to assume apical dominance, but also that we do not remove too much leaf area from the branch being shortened. If we do this, we risk either killing the branch or inducing prolific sprouting of water sprouts. The objective for pruning this oak is to increase vertical clearance of the low branches above the sidewalk. In this case, we'll be using crown raising, and we will perform the crown raising using reduction cuts. To perform crown raising with this reduction cut, I've chosen the pole pruner. The pole pruner uses a clipping mechanism and is good for small to medium-sized diameter branches. It's also very good for making reduction cuts out on the tips of branches where the limberness of the branch might make it difficult to perform a cut with a pruning saw. As always, I have first put on the appropriate personal protective equipment, and I've secured the job site to ensure that I will not harm anyone or that I will not damage property while performing the pruning. To perform the reduction cut, I will identify a lateral that is large enough to assume apical dominance and that will retain enough foliage to keep the branch alive without excessive sprouting. In performing these reduction cuts, I have not only shortened the branch, but I have also reduced the end-loading on the branch, which has led to a slight rise in the branch. As a result, there should now be sufficient clearance over the sidewalk. The advantage of using reduction cuts to achieve this crown raising objective is that I've been able to remove smaller portions of the branch and able to complete the work much more quickly and safer. The other option would have been to perform a branch removal cut on the scaffold branch at its point of origin on the trunk. However, this would have required more work and would also left behind a larger injury on the tree. This approach was unnecessary to achieve the pruning objective in this case. The third and final pruning cut type is the heading cut. A heading cut should not be confused with a topping cut. Topping cuts are unacceptable because they are internodal cuts that are used to indiscriminately reduce the height or spread of the crown of the tree and are not made back to natural unions in the tree, resulting in extensive decay and difficulties with wound closure. The heading cut is a specialized cut that is primarily used in flower production as well as structural pruning of young trees. However, it may have applications in storm repair work or other types of maintenance pruning. The key is to use good discretion in choosing to use the heading cut. A heading cut is very similar to a reduction cut in that you're shortening the primary axis of a branch. But in this case, the heading cut is making reduction back to either a bud or to a lateral that is too small to assume apical dominance. Here I have the lateral branch from a young sugar maple with the buds recently beginning to emerge from dormancy. We can look at these small branches and the bud configuration to learn a little bit more about making a heading cut. Heading cuts tend to be a little more difficult with oppositely branched trees because you end up with these pairs of buds that remain whenever a heading cut is made. I'll show you a little bit about how to deal with that. If our objective was to shorten either this terminal portion of the branch or this lateral secondary branch, we could perform a heading cut by positioning our hand clippers and making the cut just above the tip of the bud. In this particular case, a little bit of a stub is left behind, but in most cases that will not be of any consequence to the development of the lateral shoots that will develop from the buds. Oftentimes it's appropriate when you have oppositely branched trees such as this to then rub off one of the buds. What this does is it leaves behind a single shoot that will develop into a newly formed terminal leader. Once doing this, it can be possible to reach in and clip off the extraneous portion of the shoot that remains behind. This swamp white oak behind me is an example of an immature tree that could benefit from structural pruning. Structural pruning is the selective removal of branches in order to encourage proper development of branch attachment and crown architecture. In structural pruning, we are selectively removing certain scaffold branches in order to encourage proper spacing as they develop into the mature crown. We are also seeking to identify potential codominant leaders, eliminate the less desirable ones, and promote a single dominant leader. The other thing that we are attempting to do is to control the growth rate of branches that will eventually become permanent scaffold branches. A very important concept and practice that we use is subordination. Subordination is the selective removal of portions of branches in order to make them smaller and to slow their growth rate relative to other parts of the tree. In doing this, we can ensure appropriate crown architecture, ensure that branches have strong attachments, and reduce the risk for conflicts, crossing and rubbing branches, as well as included bark. The first structural issue that I addressed in the tree was performing a reduction cut on a codominant leader that emerges low in the crown. The purpose of making this reduction cut was to subordinate the branch, slowing down the growth rate of the branch so that the dominant leader gets a further leap ahead in growth rate, and also creating some vertical clearance for the development of scaffold branches in the upper half of the crown. To further promote the subordination of this codominant leader, I have made some reduction cuts on some of the secondary branches on that codominant leader. What this does is helps to distribute the pruning dose over many small branches. This helps with not only the appearance of the tree as a result of the structural pruning, such that the crown stays balanced looking, but also will help to encourage proper wound closure, because it's the most serious codominant leader on the tree. The other thing that I'm investigating looking at this tree is the growth rate of the scaffold branches, and particularly the lower scaffold branches that are part of the temporary branch structure. These are branches that will not be part of the permanent crown architecture, and we want to control their growth rate while they're young. We can ensure that it will not be necessary to make large diameter branch removal cuts later on in the tree, which will make wound response better and make the pruning for removal of branches less stressful later on in the tree's life. In strategizing for the subordination pruning on these lower temporary scaffold branches, I'm looking at the branch aspect ratio, the diameter of the branch relative to the trunk. I'm looking for those branches that have relatively large branch aspect ratios, those that are at or exceed 1/2, meaning the branch is 1/2 or greater the diameter of the trunk that supports it. In those cases, I know that these are branches that are growing aggressively and that I need to use subordination to slow down their growth rate and better control their branch aspect ratio. I do this subordination and control using a sequence of reduction cuts and heading cuts. As I subordinate the branch through a series of reduction cuts, I'm attentive to the amount of leaf area that I'm removing from the branch, because I do not want to stress the branch. So I'm using that rule of thumb of not more than 25% of the leaf area of the branch being removed. As I continue with the structural pruning, I will stop every once in a while and gather up the brush that's being created from the branch cuts. And that will allow me to keep my work site safer, but also to keep an eye on how much leaf area that I'm removing from the tree so that I do not prune the tree excessively. The tree has also developed a cluster of tightly spaced scaffold branches at the base of the crown, and I am opting to remove one of them to ensure that there's adequate space for the development of the one that remains. To remove the less desirable branch, I will use a branch removal cut and my handsaw. I will begin by making an undercut out from the attachment of the branch, and then following that with a top cut. This will relieve the excess weight of the branch, preventing a ripping cut from occurring. Then do the same step on this secondary portion of the branch. And now I'm ready to make the final collar cut at the base of the branch. The branch that remains also has a very large branch aspect ratio, so it needs some subordination to keep its growth rate under control. I will again subordinate this lateral branch using a sequence of reduction cuts and heading cuts. In this portion of the trunk, there is a tight cluster of temporary scaffold branches, and this particular scaffold branch is competing for space with this one. I'm choosing to eliminate this particular scaffold branch to improve spacing and distribution in this area, as well as to eliminate the competition with this lower branch. I will do this by performing a branch removal cut here. After performing the weight relief cut, I will now complete the branch removal cut back at the collar, keeping the saw outside of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. I will continue to make a sequence of reduction cuts and heading cuts to balance out and shape the profile of the crown of the tree, as well as to help with the subordination of these temporary scaffold branches. Pruning this tree during early spring has both advantages and disadvantages. Because the tree is beginning to actively produce foliage, that means that the vascular cambium is actively dividing throughout the tree. This should help to promote wound closure. But the advantage of being able to do this right now, before the foliage is fully emerged, is that we can better see the branch architecture of the tree because it's not obscured by foliage. Much of the attention to the structural pruning is paid to the lower half of the crown, where the temporary scaffold branches are most prominent. This is typically within 6 to 12 feet of ground level, depending on the land use around the tree and the type of clearance that will be necessary. But attention must also be paid to the scaffold branches in the upper half of the crown, with particular paying attention to those that might develop into codominant leaders and those that have large branch aspect ratios. There are only 3 or 4 scaffold branches in the upper portion of the crown of this tree, and only 1 or 2 of them need some attention with subordination pruning. When I'm making heading cuts for subordination, I try to pick a lateral bud that is pointing outward from the crown. That way the shoot that will develop will be oriented towards the outside of the crown. This is also the time that I would be looking for any secondary branches that are crossing, rubbing, or have growth oriented back towards the center of the crown. But these are of secondary concern for me. My primary concern is focusing on codominant leaders and large diameter branches, as well as poor spacing of the scaffold branches. At the very top of the crown of this tree, there's a cluster of upright branches. 2 or 3 of these could possibly develop into codominant leaders, so I want to give some attention to those. I have made the choice to completely eliminate one of the lateral branches at the top of the crown because I judge that one to be at risk of developing into a codominant leader. And the other 3 or 4 I have made primarily heading cuts to shorten them and control their growth rates through subordination. In structural pruning of this tree, I have removed about 15 to 20% of the leaf area from the crown of the tree, which is a safe dose of pruning for a young, high vitality tree such as this. And I have executed my pruning objectives using primarily reduction cuts and heading cuts. There were only 2 cases where a branch removal cut was made. In that case, it was to eliminate 2 undesirable scaffold branches. By using a large combination of reduction cuts and heading cuts, I'm better able to distribute the pruning effort throughout the perimeter of the crown of the tree. This will be less stressful for the tree. It should prevent excessive sprouting of the tree, and it should result in a tree that is more aesthetically appealing after having structural pruning completed. So here's the conclusion of the pruning work. You can see the amount of branches and leaf area that was removed from the tree, and then we can step in a little closer and see some of the pruning cuts that were made. At the base of the tree, there were 2 branch removal cuts. I'm not exactly pleased with this one here. I think that it could be made a little tighter. I think it was left a little too stubby, so I'll clean that up in just a moment. But just like a haircut, it's better to leave a little bit too much and then make a decision to take more off than the other way around. I have an opportunity to clean that up. So there's the revised version of the branch removal cut on that lower scaffold branches, and I think that the tree will respond better to that being oriented that way. Should get good even callus formation and quick wound closure. And then if you look out on the ends of some of these scaffold branches, you'll see the reduction cuts and heading cuts that have been made. This is the most conspicuous structural issue in the tree, this one particular scaffold branch. You can see that it had a very large branch aspect ratio, and it was also very upright in its growth orientation. It had elongated from the base of the crown all the way up into the upper third of the crown. And so if this had been left untreated, it would inevitably develop into a codominant leader. And if you think about this tree 10, 20, 30 years down the road, as these 2 leaders got larger in diameter relative to one another, they would encroach upon one another, they would converge, and they would trap bark between the 2 of them. That would turn into included bark and would be a structural weakness in the tree. Of course, structural pruning, it's not a one and done thing. You have to come back in and continue to prune the tree on a periodic basis as its structure continues to develop. On a tree such as this young populus, it has very high vitality and will be growing really quickly, and you would probably need to come in once every 3 or 4 years at a minimum to keep this tree under control. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about structural pruning needs of any one single tree. It is not very common that you'll be able to address all the structural concerns in the tree and keep it developing properly.